How does a nation collapse? Does it shatter in an instant, like glass? Or does it rot from within, hollowing out slowly until the final blow topples the shell? In Turkey's case, the answer is brutal. The collapse isn't coming. It's already here. Turkey in 2025 stands on the edge of economic ruin, not as a distant possibility, but as a living reality unfolding in real time. Banking failures, industrial shutdowns, a currency in free fall, mass protests, and a government choking its own people into silence. This is not the story of an economy at risk. This is the story of a nation already burning, and the world is finally beginning to smell the smoke. Look at the numbers, and the devastation is undeniable. Non-performing loans have exploded by nearly half in just 6 months. Manufacturing has suffered 16 straight months of contraction, its sharpest nosedive in decades. The lira hovers near historic lows, bleeding value while reserves vanish at breakneck speed. Capital is fleeing the country faster than at any time since the Brunson crisis of 2018. And the wealthy are dumping their fortunes abroad like rats scrambling off a sinking ship. And what does Ankara do? It silences dissent, jails opposition leaders, and pretends nothing is wrong. All while international investors, credit agencies, and watchdogs scream the same message. Turkey is crumbling. This is not the Turkey that Erdogan promised his people. Once a rising power boasting about its century of Turkey, Ankara now fights desperately just to keep its financial heart pumping. Every attempt to paper over the cracks, from regulatory forbearance in the banking sector to brutal crackdowns in the streets, only worsens the fracture lines spreading across the nation. The reality is brutal. Turkey's so-called economic miracle of the past 2 decades has turned to dust. The very pillars that sustained growth, cheap credit, foreign capital inflows, a booming industrial base, and political stability have collapsed one by one. What remains is an economy suffocated by debt, strangled by 50% interest rates, gutted by capital flight, and poisoned by authoritarian politics. The collapse is not a theory. It is a chain reaction already in motion. A banking system swollen with bad debt, an industrial sector shutting its doors, a currency that cannot be saved, a political system devouring itself in paranoia and repression. Each factor on its own could shake a nation. Together they are dragging Turkey toward its inevitable endgame, a complete breakdown of economic and political order. The only question left is whether Turkey falls with a crash that shocks the entire world, or whether it manages to stumble into a drawn-out decay, a zombie nation, hollowed out, but still staggering forward. But before we can answer that, we need to strip this story down piece by piece. We need to expose the rot in the banks, the silence in the factories, the humiliation of the lira, the great escape of capital, the rage in the streets, and the mountain of debt chains suffocating the state. Because this isn't just about numbers, it's about the fall of a nation that once dreamed of being a regional empire now reduced to fighting for survival. So, let's begin where every collapse begins, with the banks. What happens when the very foundation of your financial system turns to quicksand? What happens when the very heart of your economy starts pumping poison instead of blood? For Turkey in 2025, that is exactly what's happening. The banking system, the lifeline of every business and household, has become a festering pit of bad loans propped up only by government denial and regulatory smokescreens. And like every rotten heart, it can only keep beating for so long before the whole body collapses. Let's look at the numbers Ankara doesn't want you to see. By June 2025, non-performing loans had surged to a staggering 425 billion Turkish lira, an explosion of nearly 48% in just 6 months. That's not a crack in the dam, that's a gaping hole. And it gets worse. This figure doesn't even account for the 15 billion Turkish lira in toxic debt already dumped onto asset management companies. Strip away the tricks, and the true scale of banking distress is far beyond the official numbers. If you're enjoying this deep dive, please like the video and consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us bring more global insights. Now, back to the video. And what's driving this disaster? Zombie companies. Nearly 20% of Turkish firms are, by every honest measure, already bankrupt. They aren't operating. They're stumbling corpses, kept upright only by endless loan restructuring and government lifelines. These are businesses that should have failed years ago, but thanks to Erdogan's obsession with hiding economic weakness, they've been artificially sustained. The result? A grotesque financial ecosystem where real, productive companies suffocate while walking dead giants drain what little oxygen is left. The International Monetary Fund has already sounded the alarm, calling Turkey the world leader in walking dead companies. Think about that for a moment. Not just high levels, not just concerning levels, the worst in the entire world. This isn't economic leadership. This is economic necromancy, propping up the dead with borrowed magic until the illusion finally shatters. The regulatory forbearance that allows banks to keep these failures on life support has been extended again and again since 2018. Each extension was sold as a temporary stabilization measure. In reality, it was nothing but a cover-up. Instead of allowing natural bankruptcies that clear the system, Ankara has chosen to pile more rot on top of rot. The consequence? A hidden debt bubble so enormous that if it bursts, it will not just wound Turkey's economy, it will annihilate it. But here's the most terrifying part. This isn't theoretical anymore. It's happening. Small and mid-sized banks are already buckling under the weight of bad loans. Foreign investors see the writing on the wall and are pulling out capital. Domestic savers, terrified of losing everything, are quietly shifting their money abroad or into dollars. And every lira that leaves weakens the system further, accelerating the collapse. It's a death spiral. Bad loans cripple banks. Banks can't lend to healthy companies. Healthy companies suffocate. More firms become zombies. More loans go bad. More banks buckle. And all the while, Erdogan insists Turkey is stable, even as the floor gives way beneath him. The banking sector was supposed to be Turkey's shield, the strong foundation for its rise as a regional power. Instead, it has become the first domino to fall in a chain reaction of collapse. And once the banks fail, what happens next is inevitable. Because when your banks can no longer fund your factories, your economy's muscles wither. And that brings us to the next stage of Turkey's collapse, the death of its industrial base. What happens when the machines stop turning? For any nation, industry is the backbone of economic strength, the ability to produce, to export, to build. For Turkey, once proud of its factories churning out cars, textiles, and steel, that backbone is snapping. By mid-2025, Turkish manufacturing isn't just struggling, it's imploding. The numbers don't lie. In July 2025, the manufacturing PMI collapsed to 45.9. That's not just below the healthy 50 mark. That's the lowest level since October 2024. And more importantly, it marks the 16th consecutive month of contraction. 16 months of shrinkage, 16 months of factories scaling back, of orders vanishing, of workers being laid off. This isn't a downturn. This is a structural collapse. New orders? They've been falling for 25 straight months. Think about that. Over 2 years in which Turkish factories have failed to secure sustained new demand. For a country that has long relied on exports as its growth engine, this is catastrophic. Without new orders, factories don't just slow down, they shut down. Capacity utilization, another critical measure, tells the same bleak story. In August 2025, it fell to 73.6%, a full 2.2 percentage points lower than the previous year. That may sound small, but in manufacturing, that gap is the difference between survival and bankruptcy. Entire sectors are buckling. Investment goods production has collapsed to 68.1%, while durable consumer goods fell to 72.1%. These aren't just numbers on a page, they are assembly lines shutting off the lights. Take the automotive sector, once the jewel of Turkey's industrial crown. Production is down 3% year on year. But within that number hides an even deeper disaster. Heavy commercial vehicle manufacturing has plunged 19%. Trucks, buses, industrial vehicles, the very machines that move goods and people across Turkey, are disappearing. And when transport dies, the entire economy slows to a crawl. Factories aren't just businesses, they're ecosystems. When one plant shuts down, suppliers lose contracts, transport firms lose freight, local towns lose income, and thousands of workers lose their paychecks. Multiply that across 16 straight months of contraction, and you don't just have an industrial slowdown, you have a nationwide economic suffocation. And don't forget the bigger picture. Turkey's industrial collapse comes at the worst possible moment. Interest rates are sky high, the lira is in freefall, and energy imports are bleeding the country dry. For factories that rely on imported machinery, raw materials, or fuel, the cost of survival has doubled, sometimes tripled. Many are shutting down not because of lack of demand, but because the cost of production has become impossible. The Turkish government can extend lifelines to banks, it can silence protesters in the streets, but it cannot force factories to produce without orders. It cannot make companies invest when the cost of capital is 50%. And it cannot trick global buyers into choosing Turkish exports when the supply chain is collapsing. This is the industrial death spiral. No orders, no production, no jobs, and once jobs vanish, so does consumer demand. When people don't have money to spend, the entire domestic economy grinds down further. It's not just steel and cars, it's everything, from textiles to appliances to food processing. Industry is the muscle of a nation. And in Turkey, those muscles are withering into weakness. The machines are silent, the workers are gone, the factories are empty shells of what they once were. But what happens when the silence of the factories collides with the humiliation of a currency that can no longer buy survival? That is the next stage in Turkey's collapse, the death spiral of the lira. What happens when your money becomes worthless paper? For Turkey, the answer is written on every shop window, every gas station sign, every import invoice: humiliation. The Turkish lira, once defended as a symbol of national pride, is now the country's greatest liability. Its collapse has not only destroyed corporate balance sheets, but has shredded the very fabric of daily life. March 2025 was the breaking point. Following the arrest of Istanbul's mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu, the lira crashed to an all-time low of 40 Turkish lira per US dollar. A psychological threshold that once crossed left the nation staring into an abyss. It wasn't just a dip, it was a declaration. Global markets no longer trusted Ankara to keep its currency afloat. And despite frantic central bank interventions, the lira hasn't recovered. It remains trapped near those historic lows, a symbol of Ankara's impotence. Meanwhile, Turkey's foreign exchange reserves have bled from $165.97 billion in January to $149.9 billion by June 2025. Billions, gone in months, as the government burns through reserves to defend a currency already doomed. Strip out swaps and short-term liabilities, and the net reserves are dangerously close to zero. In simple terms, the cupboard is bare. This collapse isn't just a number on a screen, it is pain on the streets. Turkey imports over $100 billion in energy annually. Every cent the lira loses against the dollar makes energy more expensive. For factories, this means production costs spiral out of control. For households, it means skyrocketing bills for heat, electricity, and transportation. Imported inflation, a vicious cycle where a weaker lira drives higher prices, which then erode confidence in the lira even further, has become Turkey's reality. And then there's the corporate nightmare. Countless Turkish firms borrowed in foreign currencies during the boom years, believing they could repay loans with strong export revenues. But with the lira collapsing, those debts have ballooned into unpayable mountains. A company that owed $10 million suddenly owes 400 million Turkish lira, and climbing. Many are being crushed overnight, their balance sheets obliterated. Even ordinary citizens are caught in the spiral. When they see the lira evaporating, they scramble to convert savings into dollars or euros. Every time they do, it drains reserves further and pushes the lira down again. The cycle feeds itself. Collapse breeds panic. Panic accelerates collapse. And what about interest rates? The government's solution has been to jack rates up to 50%. That may slow inflation, but it strangles growth, leaving businesses unable to borrow, invest, or expand. It's a cruel trap, Leave rates high and the economy suffocates. Cut rates and the lira disintegrates. There is no way out. The lira's humiliation is more than economic, it is political. Erdogan built his empire on the promise of prosperity, stability, and strength. Today, the currency collapse exposes the lie. Turkey is no longer the rising star of emerging markets. It is a cautionary tale, a nation whose pride has turned to dust, and the world has noticed. International investors no longer see the lira as risky. They see it as toxic. That stigma will outlast the current crisis, making recovery even harder. The collapse of the lira isn't the end of Turkey's crisis, it's the accelerant. Because once the currency loses credibility, the rich and powerful do what they always do. They flee. And that takes us to the next chapter in Turkey's downfall, the great escape of capital. When the rich stop betting on their own country, why should anyone else? For years, Ankara reassured its people that Turkey's elites would hold the line, that business tycoons, investors, and bankers had too much to lose by abandoning the homeland. But 2025 shattered that illusion. The truth is brutal. The rich are no longer waiting for recovery. They are running for the exits, pulling billions out of the country in a stampede that makes ordinary Turks wonder if the game is already lost. March 2025 was the tipping point. The arrest of Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu, Erdogan's most dangerous rival, didn't just trigger protests in the streets, it triggered panic in the markets. Within weeks, Turkey suffered its largest wave of capital flight since the infamous 2018 Brunson crisis. The numbers are devastating. In March alone, domestic capital flight reached $14.72 billion. That's more than triple the foreign portfolio outflows, which stood at $4.91 billion. For every dollar foreign investors pulled, Turkish citizens themselves were taking out $3. This isn't outside distrust. This is insiders giving up. And how did they flee? In every way possible. Wealthy Turks transferred $8.76 billion abroad through bonds, equities, and foreign currency deposits. Another $3.94 billion slipped away through unidentified channels, the polite term for shadowy transfers, offshore havens, and suitcases of cash vanishing across borders. Even investment funds, once considered safe havens within Turkey, bled out. They lost 4.7% of their value in March as panicked investors yanked 101 billion Turkish lira from the system. The sharpest declines came from the very top, high net worth individuals with portfolios above 10 million Turkish lira. These weren't small savers reacting emotionally. These were the insiders, the moguls, the people who know the game better than anyone. And their decision was unanimous. Get out now. Capital flight is more than numbers on a balance sheet. It is a signal, a message that the people with the most to lose, the people who built fortunes inside Turkey, no longer trust the system to protect them. It is also a death sentence for the broader economy. When elites move their wealth abroad, the domestic banking system loses deposits, investment dries up, and credit evaporates. The spiral deepens. And let's be clear, capital flight doesn't just weaken the economy, it breaks morale. When ordinary Turks see billionaires and CEOs hoarding dollars in Switzerland, when they watch their neighbors converting every spare lira into gold, they lose faith too. That loss of faith becomes contagious, spreading through every shop, every household, every paycheck. Once people stop believing in the currency, the government, or the future, collapse accelerates. This isn't the first time Turkey has faced capital flight, but this time is different. Back in 2018, Ankara still had some credibility. It could still convince investors that recovery was possible. In 2025, after years of authoritarian crackdowns, after the destruction of institutional independence, after the lira's repeated humiliations, there is no trust left to rebuild, and Erdogan knows it. That is why his government has resorted to repression instead of reform. Instead of convincing the rich to stay, he has chosen to punish dissenters, arrest rivals, and tighten controls. But financial reality cannot be jailed. Money doesn't care about speeches or nationalism, it moves where it is safe, and right now, that is anywhere but Turkey. Capital flight is the ultimate vote of no confidence, and once the rich are gone, the cracks in the system grow into chasms. Because financial panic doesn't stay confined to balance sheets. It spills into the streets, into politics, into open revolt. So what happens when economic collapse collides with political fury? The answer is already unfolding. Turkey's streets are on fire. The collapse of the lira and the flight of Turkey's wealth did not happen in silence. They happened against a backdrop of political chaos so intense that it turned every street into a battlefield. And at the center of this firestorm was not just the economy, but the man who has ruled Turkey for more than 2 decades, Tayyip Erdogan. The trigger came in early 2025 with the arrest of Ekrem İmamoğlu, the popular mayor of Istanbul and Erdogan's most dangerous rival. For years, İmamoğlu had symbolized the hope of an alternative, a leader who could defeat Erdogan at the ballot box and restore democracy's fading pulse. His arrest sent a clear message. Erdogan was no longer willing to risk losing power through elections. If democracy posed a threat, democracy would be dismantled. The response was immediate and furious. Protests erupted across Turkey, from Istanbul's Taksim Square to the streets of Izmir and Ankara. Crowds surged through the night, chanting İmamoğlu's name, waving banners, and demanding freedom. But Erdogan's government was ready. Police flooded the streets. Tear gas clouded the air. Batons cracked against bodies. Water cannons roared against protesters who refused to disperse. And yet, the repression only fueled the fire. Students marched, workers struck. Even conservative neighborhoods, once loyal to Erdogan's party, saw murmurs of discontent. The country wasn't just divided between government and opposition, it was splintering. Erdogan's problem wasn't only the protests, it was the timing. Every clash in the streets coincided with economic collapse. As ordinary Turks lost jobs, as their savings evaporated, as food and rent soared beyond reach. The sight of a president arresting his rivals instead of fixing the crisis felt like betrayal. People weren't just angry at politics, they were angry at survival itself. And here lies the danger for any authoritarian regime. When the public believes they have nothing left to lose, repression no longer works. Fear breaks down. People risk everything because everything is already gone. That is what Erdogan faces now. A society that has reached the boiling point, where every protest is bigger, every confrontation bloodier, every arrest riskier. Even within his own party, cracks are forming. Some insiders whisper that Erdogan's gamble, crushing İmamoğlu, tightening control, ignoring reform, has backfired. Business elites, once reliable backers, now see him as a liability. Some in the AKP's ranks quietly ask, if the president can't stop the collapse, why should they go down with him? Erdogan, of course, doubles down. He blames foreign enemies, shadowy conspiracies, traitors inside Turkey. He tells the people that chaos is a foreign plot, not his failure. But propaganda has its limits. You can't feed your children with speeches. You can't pay rent with nationalism. And when the propaganda no longer works, all that remains is raw power. The police, the army, the prisons. Yet even raw power has cracks. Police forces are exhausted after weeks of non-stop protests. Courts are overwhelmed with cases. Jails are overflowing. The system is stretched thin, and every new wave of protests pushes it closer to collapse. What Erdogan faces now is not a political opposition in parliament. It is something far more dangerous. A population that no longer believes in the rules of the game. Once people stop playing by the script, once they decide the system itself is illegitimate, the downfall of regimes accelerates. This is why Turkey today feels less like a government in control and more like a volcano on the edge of eruption. Each protest, each crackdown, each arrest adds pressure, and when the eruption comes, it won't be gradual, it will be explosive. And when politics catch fire, geopolitics are never far behind, because Turkey's crisis isn't just internal, it's starting to shake the entire region. When your economy collapses and your streets burn, the world notices, and it doesn't knock politely. Turkey's internal chaos isn't happening in a vacuum. The country that once sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, leveraging its strategic position between continents, is now facing diplomatic isolation the likes of which it hasn't seen in decades. And make no mistake, this isolation is not accidental. It's the inevitable consequence of political repression, economic mismanagement, and reckless foreign adventures. First, consider the European Union. Turkey's arrest of Imamoglu sparked outrage in Brussels and Strasbourg alike. The Council of Europe and European Parliament condemned the detentions as politically motivated. Sanctions are quietly being drafted. Trade negotiations stall. Investors who once treated Turkey as a gateway to the Middle East are now hesitant to expose capital to Erdogan's volatile rule. The EU isn't the only actor. The United States, already frustrated by Ankara's unpredictable foreign policy and authoritarian slide, is signaling that support is conditional, not guaranteed. Meanwhile, regional neighbors are watching carefully. Greece, Cyprus, and Israel are recalibrating their strategies, seeing Turkey not as a rising regional power but as a state teetering on collapse. Military missteps, economic weakness, and political instability have emboldened rivals. Ankara's long-standing claims over energy in the Eastern Mediterranean are suddenly weaker. Investments in regional alliances and energy projects are drying up. Turkey is, in effect, becoming a strategic pariah. Even traditional allies in the Middle East are reassessing ties. Gulf states, once reliant on Turkish construction and infrastructure projects, are now halting contracts or demanding payments up front. Foreign firms are pulling personnel, freezing expansion plans, and pricing political risk into every transaction. The once booming Turkish defense and construction sectors are seeing orders canceled or delayed. Ankara's aggressive foreign policy no longer commands respect, it invites caution. This isolation isn't just financial or diplomatic, it's psychological. Turkey's government faces a credibility collapse abroad. Deals are harder to strike, loans harder to secure, and negotiations are now framed by risk assessments rather than goodwill. In essence, Turkey is being cornered, and corners in global politics are dangerous. Once a nation loses the trust of allies, it has nowhere to turn in a crisis. And yet, the most frightening aspect is that this isolation amplifies the internal collapse. Without foreign financing, the central bank's dwindling reserves cannot be replenished. Currency interventions fail. Zombie companies already on life support have no hope of attracting overseas capital. Capital flight accelerates. Every day, every hour, the gap between what Turkey owes and what it can pay widens. In short, geopolitical isolation feeds the economic crisis, which feeds the political crisis, which feeds isolation again. It is a vicious cycle. Turkey's international position, once a pillar of influence, now mirrors its domestic vulnerability, overstretched, under-resourced, and on the edge of catastrophe. The question now becomes, how long can Erdogan cling to power when the world no longer supports him? When internal protests rage, and when every financial indicator screams collapse. Once Turkey loses its strategic leverage, every ally it once counted on becomes indifferent. And indifference in geopolitics is often as deadly as outright hostility. And if the world begins to turn its back, what happens when Turkey's economic, political, and social crises converge with external pressures? So how much debt does it take to implode a nation? In Turkey's case, the answer is terrifyingly close. Turkey's external debt isn't just a number on a balance sheet, it's a ticking time bomb, and the fuse is almost spent. By Q1 2025, foreign obligations reached a staggering $527.5 billion, roughly 45% of GDP, an all-time high for the country. And unlike domestic debt, foreign creditors don't wait politely. They demand payment in real currency, not promises. Every missed interest payment, every delayed rollover, every slight dip in confidence increases the risk of a full-blown financial meltdown. The central bank's reserves, already strained from currency interventions, are hemorrhaging. From $165.97 billion in January 2025 down to $149.9 billion by June, Turkey has little room for maneuver. Net reserves, when accounting for swaps and short-term obligations, are dangerously low. Any shock, even a minor one, could trigger immediate default. And the political instability that began with the arrest of Imamoglu only accelerates this risk. Creditors now view Turkey as a high-risk borrower, demanding higher interest rates or refusing to refinance altogether. The current account deficit compounds the problem. Turkey imported over $100 billion in energy annually, meaning that every lira lost in currency value inflates the cost of imports. By Q1 2025, the deficit widened to $4.5 billion per month, compared to $3.2 billion the previous year. Financing these deficits requires steady inflows of foreign capital, but capital flight is raging. Domestic and international investors are withdrawing cash, leaving the government scrambling to cover obligations. And then there's the rollover challenge. Turkish banks and corporates rely on constant refinancing of foreign currency loans. If even a small portion of these loans cannot be rolled over, the domino effect could be catastrophic. Banks would fail. Corporations would collapse. The government would be forced into emergency measures, including currency devaluation, capital controls, or direct bailouts. Consider a single hypothetical scenario. If 30 million citizens convert $500 each to dollars, the central bank would instantly lose $15 billion in reserves. With net reserves already near zero, this would trigger massive devaluation, cripple imports, and likely provoke social unrest on a national scale. The math is simple, but the consequences are anything but. It's not just the numbers, it's the timing. The zombie company epidemic means that 20% of Turkish businesses are effectively bankrupt, surviving only on government forbearance and cheap credit. A sudden collapse in external financing would tip these fragile companies over the edge. Overwhelming banks already weighed down by non-performing loans. In short, the external debt time bomb would set off a chain reaction. Corporate bankruptcy to bank failure to currency collapse to political chaos. Turkey's economic model, dependent on consumption-driven growth fueled by foreign capital, is unraveling under its own weight. Without immediate access to external financing, the country cannot service debt, pay for imports, or stabilize the currency. Every day that passes increases the probability that creditors will refuse to refinance, that inflation will accelerate, and that social unrest will erupt. The ultimate question: when the debt time bomb explodes, will Turkey crash in a controlled descent, or will it implode violently, dragging the entire economy into chaos? What happens when a fifth of a country's companies are already dead, but still walking? Turkey is about to find out. Turkey isn't just struggling with debt and currency collapse, its corporate sector is rotting from within. According to the IMF, nearly 20% of Turkish companies are zombies, meaning they survive only through government support, loan restructuring, or cheap credit. These firms generate barely enough revenue to cover interest payments, let alone invest in growth, innovation, or wages. In other words, they are corporate corpses kept alive artificially. The scale of the problem is staggering. Total loss of $425 billion in non-performing loans as of June 2025 shows the banking system is already drowning under bad debt. But that number hides the true threat. Zombie companies keep borrowing just to stay afloat, masking the depth of insolvency. Regulators have turned a blind eye since 2018, extending forbearance measures and delaying bankruptcies. The result? A massive hidden debt bubble ready to explode. Why is this dangerous? Because zombies don't just fail quietly, they drag the entire financial system down with them. Banks are forced to continue lending to keep these companies alive. Healthy companies face higher borrowing costs as credit becomes scarce. Investors avoid Turkey entirely, fearing that any shock will topple the entire corporate structure. And in the event of a broader crisis, the simultaneous collapse of so many companies could overwhelm banks, sparking a systemic banking failure. The zombie epidemic is especially pronounced in manufacturing and construction, Turkey's once proud industrial backbone. These sectors are already 16 months into contraction, with manufacturing capacity utilization down to 73.6%. Zombie firms hoard resources and credit, preventing healthier companies from expanding, investing, or hiring. The result is a suffocating economy where even profitable firms struggle to survive. Add the political context. Investors and businesses are increasingly wary of government intervention, crackdowns, and policy unpredictability. This lack of trust discourages risk-taking and slows recovery. Zombie companies become anchors weighing down the economy, ensuring that even minor external shocks, a further Lira drop, a missed debt rollover, or a renewed capital flight, could ignite a chain reaction of corporate and banking failures. The big question is timing. How long can the government prop up companies that should have failed years ago? With non-performing loans surging 48% in 6 months, the answer is not long. Every month of delay adds more fragility, more debt, and more risk of a simultaneous collapse. The consequence is clear. Zombie companies are not just a symptom of Turkey's economic decay. They are a catalyst for its collapse. Once these firms fail en masse, banks will implode, employment will drop, and investor panic will reach new heights. It's a slow-burning crisis with a guaranteed explosive finale. The transition question: if corporate rot is the heart of Turkey's internal decay, what happens when the currency that fuels the entire system collapses under this weight? Turkey's collapse is not a distant possibility. It is unfolding right now, in real time, with every economic indicator flashing red. From the banking sector's hidden insolvency to the manufacturing implosion, from the Lira's historic collapse to the unprecedented capital flight, every pillar of Turkey's economy is under siege. Political repression and authoritarian crackdowns only accelerate the downward spiral, eroding both domestic confidence and international credibility. The convergence of these crises creates a perfect storm. Zombie companies consume credit, leaving real businesses starved. Factories shut down while workers lose jobs, destroying production capacity. Citizens scramble to protect savings as inflation spikes and the Lira tumbles. Foreign investors flee, and external debt pressures mount to unsustainable levels. The scenarios that could trigger a total collapse are clear. A mass conversion of Lira to dollars, a simultaneous burst of zombie companies, or a final tipping point in manufacturing shutdowns could unleash an economic avalanche. With each passing month, the likelihood of a controlled descent diminishes, making a catastrophic crash almost inevitable. Turkey's economic model, once hailed as resilient, is exposed as fragile, overly dependent on external financing, political stability, and continuous credit flow. Now, all three are in jeopardy. The collapse has begun, and the only question left is how devastating it will be. A managed decline or an outright economic cataclysm that erases decades of growth. The warning signs are unmistakable. The world is watching, and Turkey itself must confront a stark truth. The time for half measures is over. The collapse is here. It is not coming. It is already happening. If you found this analysis valuable, please consider subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into geopolitics. We would love to hear your thoughts. Drop your comments below and let us know what you think. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.